A beautiful Friday morning here in Cleveland, Ohio. The sunny weather is finally broken, and it thought that would be a great opportunity to take what is likely the most magnificent car we've ever had. This 1932 Marmon 16 with a custom body by Waterhouse out for a drive. This is one of 3 custom-bodied Marmon 16s built, one of 2 built on the 154-inch chassis, and 2 built by Waterhouse. It was originally built for Alta Prentice, who is the youngest daughter of John D. Rockefeller, as a 30th wedding anniversary gift from her husband Ezra. It was in the Rockefeller family until 1962, when noted collector Bill Harrah bought it from the estate, and it remained in the Harrah collection until the auction in 1985. 3 owners in total, known ownership history, and largely unrestored save for a paint job and chrome when it was with the Harrah collection. It's sitting here idling almost silently at about 400 RPM. And since traffic is light and roads are clear, I thought we might take it for a drive. Let's take a look under the hood. The Marmon V16, 491 cubic inches of all aluminum artwork. It's an absolutely extraordinary piece of engineering, particularly when you consider that they designed this using paper and pencil without the benefit of calculators or computers. And they handed it to a guy in the machine shop and he built the parts. For it to work this well and to be this extraordinarily smooth is absolutely amazing. The Marmon 16 lives at the very top of the collector car food chain, and only one American mark stands above it, and that would be Duesenberg. But I think if you ask the Marmon guys, they might give you a bit of an argument. We'll take this one for a drive, and I'll explain why I think this is such a special car. Inside the Marmon, it is ticking over almost silently, about 150 degrees, good oil pressure, ready to go. And I'm going to spend less time talking and more time driving because this is such a treat. These gigantic cars with their equally gigantic engines were designed for completely effortless motoring. It wasn't about more speed necessarily, although this is a rather fast car for the era, despite its enormous size. But it was about smoothness and effortlessness. Shifting on this car is virtually optional unless you're at a dead stop, and even then, it's probably got enough torque to move itself around. The Marmon 16, as I mentioned, 491 cubic inches, was rated at a nice round 200 horsepower. But a road test in the 60s by, I believe, Popular Mechanics did some acceleration testing, and their math says it was probably closer to 240 or 250 horsepower and about 400 pounds of torque. So this was a very substantial engine in a time when Fords had 65 horsepower. Synchromesh on the transmission was, of course, part of the deal. They did buy their transmissions from General Motors, as a matter of fact. But for anything requiring any acceleration, downshifts are optional. Hills, whatever. Big Marmon doesn't care. It's probably worth noting that it's Marmon, not Mormon. It has nothing to do with Mormonism. I've likened Marmons to luxury cars built by racers. Marmon won the very first Indy 500 with the Wasp race car, and they were headquartered in Indianapolis. As a result, you'll see a pretty impressive dedication to minimalism, reduced weight. This car is almost entirely aluminum, including the engine and the body. So even though it's immense, it only weighs in at about 6,000 pounds. Likewise, the brakes are enormous. They're still mechanical, but they are power assisted, and they are about 30% larger than the brakes on a Duesenberg J. And on the street, they are extremely impressive for a car of this vintage. Because Marmon had all of that engine up there pushing the car around, they didn't need to use extremely tall gears. This car, for instance, has 3.69 gears, which for 1932 is extremely tall, and that gives it great highway cruising ability. This car will cruise all day at 60 miles an hour without any effort, and as a matter of fact, we're rolling along here at about 50 without even thinking twice. Although 50 was getting kind of busy for almost all the other Marmon's peers. I'm not going to downshift for this corner. I'm just going to bend it around and let that big bottomless well of torque just pull it through. No stumbles, no hesitation, just a gigantic car pulling itself along with effortless ease. You can't feel it running. There's almost no vibrations. I can distantly hear it, mostly a little grumble coming from the twin tailpipes out back. And it doesn't sound like anything else. It's not like two V8s, it's not like two straight 8s. It's a sound unto itself. I think that's kind of neat. It's not an unpleasant sound, it's a nice, purposeful grumble. But at idle, it's virtually silent, and here at speed, going up little hills like this and leaning on it, I can hear it a little bit. But the primary sound I hear right now is wind noise from the wind wings, and that's all just the air forcing itself between the windshield and the wind wings. Mechanically, it is virtually silent. Of course, you're very much aware that there's a lot of car around you, and there's still another 12 or 15 feet behind me. It is gigantic. So it's certainly not a sports car, but it has the moves of something this big shouldn't have. Something else I like about the 16s is that they were very subdued. Duesenbergs were flashy. The Cadillac V16, very flashy. The Marmon has no horns, no cowl lights, no fog lights. The hood ornament is very simple and sedate. In fact, there aren't even any names or badges on the car aside from the Marmon 16 spelled out on the hubcaps. But even inside here, there's no marking, nothing that says Marmon aside from a crest here on the horn button. Gauges are simple, white on black markings. Once again, that big bottomless well of torque just makes shifting completely optional when you're going through town. Instrument panel has a full array of all the gauges you want. They're easy to read. They all work. It has 4 aircraft-style levers under the dash that control throttle, choke, spark advance, and heat for the carburetor, which you don't need today. I've never much understood why they hid the speedometer behind the steering wheel. It is completely obscured and I'm totally unable to see it. I have no idea how fast I'm going. Well, we're going about 40. It's worth mentioning that when Ezra had this car built, he instructed them to make the speedometer read 5 miles an hour fast. That was because he didn't want Alta's chauffeur scaring her with excessive speed. So that was his way of tricking them into keeping the speeds kind of reasonable. And to this day, it does indeed read 5 miles an hour fast. I mentioned earlier how there's a distinct lack of ornamentation and nomenclature on the car. There's still no denying that this is a 16. The Marmons had a very distinctive look. The tall vertical grille, the oval-shaped headlights, and those interesting front fenders that are kind of clipped and flattened at the leading edge make these just as distinctive as anything else from the classic era. So it's not like you needed a lot of nameplates to show everybody what you owned. And I think that worked out well with what Howard Marmon preferred. The history I've read on him, he doesn't strike me as an egotist. He liked going fast, he liked showing people what he could do, but for him it wasn't about putting his name, it wasn't about being showy. I think he built this car just to see if he could do it. Development started in 1926. When times were good, they had no way of knowing that the stock market would crash in 1929. And when it did, they had no choice but to press ahead and see what happened. Owen Nacker, who is widely regarded as the father of the Cadillac V16, was part of that initial Marmon development team, and he went to Cadillac pretty early on. And I have to imagine on his first day of work at Cadillac, he walked in and said, "Hey guys, you're never going to believe what Howard's working on." I like to think that's the genesis of the Cadillac V16. They were working on the 12, and they knew they had to match Lincoln and Packard there, but a 16? That was something else. To date, only 3 manufacturers have ever built a V16, Marmon, Cadillac, and an Italian supercar maker named Cizeta. And it really is much too much engine. There's just no excuse. There's no need for 491 cubic inches of 16-cylinder engine. But it certainly is remarkable to open the hood and ask people to count the spark plugs, and then remind them that there are another 8 on the other side. It's really extraordinary. Again, the point of all that was torque and smoothness. And in that regard, it really succeeds. Here we are rolling along at about 50 miles an hour. It just does it like it does it every day. It doesn't even mind. In my 1929 Cadillac, for instance, 50 miles an hour is pretty busy. You feel like you're stressing the car, but this, it creeps up on you and you don't even notice. As I mentioned, brakes are enormously powerful. It pulls it down from speed effortlessly. There's a little rev, you can hear it, but at idle it's virtually silent. There's nothing in there to hear. There's a distant mechanical sound that's very pleasant and a little bit of a hum out back. And again, I can't feel it running. There's not a vibration anywhere. Not through the steering wheel, not through the shifter, nothing. This car does have a freshly rebuilt engine, and that's a fairly extraordinary story in and of itself. We have receipts for almost $52,000 for rebuilding this engine, and that is not including 2 brand new aluminum cylinder heads cast by Edelbrock. Marmons, being all aluminum, were subject to a lot of corrosion and deterioration inside the heads just because of the coolant or lack thereof over the past 80 years. So a great many of them have heads that have been welded and cut or are just simply beyond repair. So a few years ago, the Marmon Club approached Edelbrock and asked them to cast brand new Marmon 16 cylinder heads. Edelbrock apparently didn't really want the job, so they quoted the club $10,000 per cylinder head, thinking that would be enough to discourage them. Instead, they said, "Perfect, how soon can you start?" As a result, they cast, I believe, 70 or 75 pairs of heads, one for every Marmon 16 automobile still in existence. This car has a fresh set of those Edelbrock cylinder heads on it, and they are indistinguishable from the originals externally. Internally, they have various improvements in airflow, CNC porting, casting quality, a whole bunch of different little details that made them better. I don't know that it necessarily makes any more horsepower, but I also don't think you'll have to buy another set of cylinder heads 80 years from now. The third and most recent owner enjoyed driving this car so much, he put about 43,000 miles on it in the 35 years that he owned it. That's a lot of driving in a car like this. He twice drove it across the country, once to Yellowstone Park and once to Oregon for a national meet. And he drove it. He didn't trailer it. He drove it. And he was such a fan of using this car that he would frequently drive it to a meet, have his transportation guys bring him a second car, which he would drive to yet another meet, have them pick up this car, deliver it to yet a third meet, and continually leapfrog his cars across the country all summer during show season. But when it was time to rebuild this engine, he didn't want to take the car off the road. So he sourced a replacement V16 engine, had that engine rebuilt, and installed in this car while the original engine was being rebuilt. That way he didn't have to stop driving it. He could still enjoy the car. And when this engine was finished, it was reinstalled. Today it has about 1,000 miles on it. It is the car's original engine. And it just drives superbly thanks to work by Frank Simi and Sons and Capaldi Enterprises. At the same time, the transmission was rebuilt. It has a new clutch. Brakes were relined. Starter, generator, water pump, carburetor, fuel pump were all rebuilt. So mechanically, this car is excellent, ready to tour as new, and fully sorted. The noise you hear right now is a diesel truck next to me. It is not the noise of the Marmon. This car is causing quite a stir here in traffic. I can watch everybody do a double take when they see this enormous thing plowing through. There's really no need to rev this big engine. It makes so much torque. Just get it into third gear as quick as possible and let it go. I'm sure that's how the original driver would have done it. But I'm going to lean on it a little bit here. This is about 65, and it is completely effortless. I mean, 65 miles an hour in a car without overdrive from 1932 is mind-boggling. And it feels like it would run at this speed all day long. The engine is a distant hum. It doesn't feel like it's being stressed. That's just extraordinary. I'm sure Duesenberg guys get it, maybe some of the Packard guys, but anybody else who's got a 1932 car going 65 miles an hour, they're probably looking pretty carefully at oil pressure at that point. God, it's so nice to just fling it around. This car completely ignores hills. And touring in this car must be a joy. It tracks beautifully. I mean, for a car on bias ply tires, it tracks better than my late model cars with radials. A lot of that's due to the restoration quality, but Marmon also used Ross steering boxes, which were widely regarded as some of the best. The steering effort is quite light, even for such an enormous car. You can turn the wheel with about half the effort of most cars sitting still. And as long as you're rolling, it really doesn't take much more than your fingertips to guide this car along. But as you're watching, note that I'm not sawing on this wheel. I'm not constantly correcting, keeping this car going straight like I do with many other cars of the period. This sucker is set up right, tracks straight, and Jesus, for something this old to be this good at going down the road is extremely impressive. On the other hand, it originally cost 3 times more than a house, about $6,000. Actually, with the custom body, this one was $6,800. When you could buy a Ford for about $500. So I suppose the expectations were significant when you were spending that much money. You can hear it running. I mean, it's a cool day. It's about 50 degrees out, so we're running at about 140 degrees. Plenty of oil pressure, plenty of electricity, even the fuel gauge works. I don't know what fuel economy is on this car. It is probably somewhere between terrible and unbelievably bad, but who cares? The man who owns this car isn't going to think about anything but how good it feels to be behind the wheel. And I'm glad to see that the 16 is finally getting the respect that I think it's always deserved. For many years, it sort of lived in the shadows and didn't even really get the same respect that even a Cadillac 16 would. But in recent years, values have crept up significantly. And for unusual custom-bodied cars with great history, pause there a little bit to let you hear the engine. But for custom cars like this, with a known history, there aren't many that can live above it. Like I said, the Duesenberg, a handful of European cars, and only the most exclusive Cadillacs. Most of the Marmons had factory bodies. Most advertising, and it's widely regarded that they were designed by LeBaron, but that isn't true. LeBaron built them, but they were designed by a young man named Walter Norwood Teague, son of a designer. His father didn't want the job. He threw it to his son, who was a college student, and he designed the Marmons. They're handsome cars. Most of them were four-door sedans and limousines, but a handful of convertible sedans and convertible coupes and 3 custom-bodied cars were built. And they're handsome in their own way. Including this one. which despite its enormous proportions, looks fantastic from any angle. It doesn't look overgrown or bloated or like a school bus. It's an enormous car that actually looks pretty sleek. If you watch our videos regularly, you've probably seen the Power Wagon test drive, and this car has the same apparent attitude from other drivers. They see this big old car pull out in front of them on the road, and you can see their faces fall a little bit, that they're disappointed that they're stuck behind a slow old car. One, it's kind of sad that people feel that way, but two, they are inevitably surprised by how quickly and easily this car accelerates. A lot of old cars really are rolling roadblocks in modern traffic. This is not one of them. There's always so much power in reserve. I mean, a half throttle squeeze up to about 55 miles an hour is like nothing. And again, you have the confidence of these enormously powerful brakes, a surprisingly competent steering system, and pretty darn good ride quality. That was one of the advantages of these enormous wheelbases, is that they tended to smother bumps. Of course, with leaf springs and live axles at both ends, there's really only so much you can do. But this car oozes over the bumps more than bouncing over them like a smaller car would. And of course, our pavement quality here in Cleveland is pretty terrible. And again, no need for a downshift at slow speeds. This is a 7-passenger, I suppose you could call it a touring, 7-passenger. There is a lot of space behind the driver's seat. It has 2 folding jump seats that are probably as comfortable as the standard seats in many other cars. And there's certainly plenty of legroom for everybody. I don't know that Mrs. Prentice ever carried 7 people in her car. She probably just perched herself there on the back seat on warm days and was driven around. But the open air experience is always nice. This car does have full tonneaus for the front and rear compartments, so it closes up well if you choose to use it for touring. Again, from about 8 miles an hour, no downshift is needed. Just clean acceleration, no hitches, no hiccups, no stumbles. This car is extremely well tuned by Jim Capaldi. The Marmons use a single Stromberg 2-barrel downdraft carburetor, which Marmon argued was more effective than Cadillac's dual updraft, and they said it provided more equal fuel distribution. I can't argue with that. In fact, this car has quite a few engineering advancements. The downdraft carburetor, when they were only just now coming into fashion, it has a fuel pump instead of a vacuum tank. It has overhead valves when many cars were still flatheads. And it's worth noting that even the push rods are made of aluminum so that the metal would expand at the same rate as the block and heads, and valve clearance would remain consistent at all temperatures. And these guys were really thinking about making these cars work well. And for those of you who make excuses for old cars, when they don't work right, you have to remember that the guys designing and building these cars, they knew what they were doing. And no one who spent $6,000 in 1932 was going to put up with bad manners from their new luxury car. When they are right, they are superb. Getting them right can be very expensive, and most people simply don't know the difference, which is a shame. But once you do know the difference, it's very hard to go back. I have the benefit of driving a lot of different cars and trying a lot of different things out, and I will say with a great deal of confidence that only a tiny fraction of the cars of any type, any price, any make work as well as this one does. And that is not only due to the fact that it was expertly serviced, all the fresh restoration pieces under the hood, but also because it was used regularly. The reason your daily driver works and is reliable is because you drive it every day. The third and final owner of this car, he drove it all the time. He didn't think twice about jumping in and driving it to work. He drove it on day tours, he took it out to lunch, and as a result, this sucker just works. If you take nothing else from this is my advice. Take your old cars out and use them as cars. Cosmetic perfection is fine. This car has plenty of blemishes. The paint's probably 45 years old. But use your car. It will work better. It will last longer. And I'd argue you'll have more fun than pulling it around in a trailer. I don't want this test drive to end. I've got about 3/8 of a tank of gas left. I'm gonna burn it. Nice ride quality. A little springy, but as I said, it kind of eases itself over bumps rather than bouncing. Stop signs are a second gear affair. And it'll just ease itself over these train tracks. No problem. God, that's nicer than my new Cadillac. Breaks my heart to pull in and end the drive, but we're going to stop here. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.